Well, I think what happens sometimes with politicians is arrogance and greed starts to cloud their judgment, and that's definitely what happened here. Even before, when rumors started happening, circulating of an election coming, a lot of people said we don't want one right now. Why? Because we're in the midst of a pandemic. People don't want to go to polling centers. They want the government to focus on the matters at hand. And also, it was right when Afghanistan was exploding and Trudeau promised to take 20,000 refugees from Afghanistan. That didn't happen. So it was really bad timing on his part. But I think, again, it's part of the Trudeau kind of brand, if you will. And I hope he forgives me for saying this. I think his father had this a bit too when he was prime minister, of just going for that majority when the polls showed otherwise.
Yeah. His government, though, has handled COVID relatively well. So was it a surprise that there was this kind of backlash?
There was. Yes, you're right. It has been handled relatively well. But having said that, we are actually in a fourth wave with the Delta variant. And the thing Canadians fear the most are the kind of lockdowns which you've been reporting on just now. So I think we're going to be going to the path of micro lockdowns if necessary. Look, the other thing that's been happening here is that I think most people are confused by the public health messaging. There's been a lot of conflicting advice. The other thing that's been happening are the various provinces have been implementing their own policies, but also their own technologies. So, for example, we have several different vaccine passports now on our devices as we travel across the country. But I think, again, the main thing is that Canadians are very fearful because of the pandemic that the economy may go southwards, and without an all-hands-on-deck approach, we'll never get out of this.
It's fascinating to watch the polls, though. You have the Conservatives ahead one day, and then Trudeau seems to kind of bounce back. Do you think this is going to really go down to the wire?
It will go down to the wire. I think what we're seeing now in, the 6 or so days left is very attack U.S.-style politics that we've never seen before. So that's quite surprising in a polite former British colony like ours. But I think the attacks from the opposition are very targeted. For example, they're targeting Trudeau for promising to be a feminist. He never was one. For reconciliation with Indigenous people, that's gone very poorly. And for bringing back the big one, ethical government. And there have been numerous scandals in this government that happened on his watch. So I think he's going to pay a heavy price for that, but also for really calling an election nobody wanted.
Yeah, and well before time. Let's talk a little bit about his main contender. What do we know about her?
Well, Aaron O'Toole is relatively new to the Canadian political scene. He's seen as relatively boring compared to the very charismatic Trudeau, who's very comfortable on the public stage. In fact, O'Toole spent a lot of time in the campaign campaigning virtually from a very slick TV studio in Toronto. There's a lot of discontent among the Canadian voters in terms of how the pandemic has been handled, but also where the economy is going. Our inflation rates are going up. And the other thing in the election, by the way, is people in Sydney, Australia would relate this, is sky-high housing prices, that most housing is now out of the reach of most Canadians. And that's very little a Prime Minister can
do
address.
about that. And in terms of O'Toole, is he likely to need a coalition partner? Would there be any chance of him getting a majority?
Yeah, I think any winner, victor, will probably have to go to the Governor General, I think a similar system to yours, and ask to form a government. And definitely it will rely on the support of the minority parties, including the one in Quebec as well, which has a very different agenda. So this tells me that the election may not be decided on election night itself on the 20th, but in the few days to come, where there's a bit of horse trading going on, and then we'll decide what kind of coalition can be formed. But one quick thing, I mean, most Canadians thought the government was working fine, Parliament was working fine beforehand in a minority situation. Why call an election two years before the mandate's completed?
Yeah, so true. And as you say, if he loses too, it could do lasting damage to the whole Trudeau dynasty, such as it is.
Yes, absolutely. He was doing relatively well. He's the Teflon Prime Minister. He managed to avoid many of those scandals, and they were big ones. They were very big ones sticking to him. The other thing, quickly, we've seen happen in this campaign, which is very unusual, is foreign affairs seep into the narrative. Afghanistan, which I mentioned, but don't forget the unresolved issue of the two Michaels imprisoned in China in return for us holding the Huawei executive on a U.S. warrant. They're now more than 1,000 days in captivity, and despite everything Trudeau has done and said, there's no end in sight to that particular case, and it pains a lot of Canadians, trust me.
Yeah, it is such a tricky one, and one that, Australia understands. The Chinese are being very tough masters at the moment. Michael, lovely as always. Thank you so much. We'll watch with interest as it plays out.
My pleasure. Bye-bye.